Well, let me welcome you here once again to our informal pop-up chat show, just to work through a topic that really is all about communicating well and kind of understanding things in a bit more interactive detail. So I'd like to welcome Bruce Burgess for coming up today and speaking with us. Bruce, thanks for coming and being here.
Great to be here, John.
Bruce, I'd like to start, this may be the wrong place to start, but I'm aware that you're a lawyer by training back in the day, and we're talking today about resolving conflict. Aren't you doing yourself out of a living there, trying to resolve conflict, and don't lawyers kind of live off conflict?
That's a low blow to start with, John. Well, actually, it is true that many lawyers do make a living out of conflict, but surprisingly, there are actually lawyers who don't get motivated by conflict and actually want to try and help their clients resolve issues. In my particular case, I saw a lot of conflict taking place even between Christians, and I was deeply disturbed at what sort of an impact that had on people's perception of Christianity and Jesus, and so I actually became motivated to go and study to learn more about how to deal with conflict well and not through sort of litigation and court and the way lawyers typically deal with conflict.
Great. So you've been on a bit of a journey there, but you brought your family with you. So you're married to Helen, you've got Lachlan and Ariel, and has that been a journey for them as well?
It has. When I first went to college, Lachlan was only 1 or something, so he wasn't really aware of what I was doing. But I went to college initially. It was going to be 1 year integrating life and faith and work. Ended up being 7 years. Not because I was a bad student, but just there was more that I wanted to study, and Helen was very supportive. So then as the kids grew up, I guess we went on this journey together of trying to learn as a family how to deal with each other well when the inevitable conflicts arise. And so these principles that the Bible has on how to deal with relationships and challenge and conflict have been really helpful for us as a family.
Wonderful. But you are now the head of an organisation called Peacewise, the National Director. What does that look like exactly?
Yeah, so Peacewise is a cross-denominational ministry. We work all over the country, and we both do teaching to help people learn how to deal with conflict well using the principles in the Bible, and we also become involved in actual conflict situations. So sometimes in churches or schools or workplaces or just between people need help. And so we become involved as mediators or conflict coaches and help try and help people deal with the issues and resolve things at a relational level as well, which is one of the distinctives of a Christian way of dealing with conflict.
It sounds like then you've kind of seen it all. What are the different ways? We've got a range of people here. I imagine people have a range of ways of dealing with conflict. What are the big categories?
Yeah, well, the big categories are the ones that most people will have heard of, which is fight and flight. And if you want to get out your little card here, on the slope here on the front, it talks about fight responses as being the attack responses. So that's when, in order to get what I want in a conflict, I get aggressive. And I might be verbally aggressive, or I might even get physically aggressive because that's the way I want to get what I want. On the other side of the slope, the flight responses are more about escaping and like pretending that the conflict doesn't exist or denying it or in some way trying to get away from the conflict. So sometimes people might leave a place that they belong to, like a workplace or a church or even a relationship they might leave, or they might stay but leave in terms of connection with the person.
All right, so there's kind of attack and escape, flight and fight. We want to get really practical today, so I want to make up the scenario, and I rush to say this is made up, it's drawn from the strands of experience, but let me imagine my home life, and imagine I come home from a long day at work, and Julie's there cleaning up some horrific mess from one of our kids. They're all screaming, there's no whiff of dinner in the air, but I've come home from a long day, and I say, "Hi honey, when's dinner?" And you're shaking your head already, Bruce. And Julie, perhaps, I imagine, looks at me like I've just killed the cat or killed JFK or some great crime. And from there, we could go down different tracks. So we could do you said the attack response, so maybe you can get into a shouting match. This has never happened, but we could get into a shouting match. more likely, I'm an escaper, so I think we could just have a very deathly silent dinner, if we didn't have kids. We could have a deathly silent dinner and I could disappear to the shed afterwards. That might be escape. But you're saying there's something in the middle of this.
Yeah.
There's options between those.
Yeah.
And I imagine Peacewise has a framework for talking about that space in the middle.
Yeah, so this would not be, we wouldn't say this is the only way to respond to conflict biblically and from a Christian perspective, but it is a really helpful way. So if you look in the middle of your card, there's an explanation of 4 steps. And this is just a simple framework you can use in any conflict. So the starting point, go higher. So rather than if we're thinking about your situation, how can John get Julie to make the meal that should have been there? How can he get her to be the sort of wife he wants her to be? Rather than that, actually starting with, well, okay, how can I please and honour God in this situation? God, please help me to have a right way of thinking and acting in this situation. So starting, instead of getting the other person to do what you want, God, please help me. So going higher, if you like, than just my normal base level human reaction. Secondly, let's get real. Let's think about our own contribution. So if we think about the well-known Bible passage, get the log out of your own eye first, so that you can see clearly to take the speck out of Julie's eye. It's about taking responsibility for my contribution before I go and try and tell someone else what they've done. Third part of the framework, gently engaging the other person. So seeking to restore them. If we're thinking about, again about biblical language, there's a passage in Galatians that talks about if you see someone who's in sin, then you who are spiritually gently restore them. So that's actually about trying to approach that person in a loving and gentle way with a heart to actually being able to talk constructively about the issue, what they've contributed to the conflict, but with a heart to restore the relationship, not to sort of prove a point and prove that you're right. So if you've got the log out of your own eye and you've confessed and asked to be forgiven for what you've done wrong, then the fourth part is trying to get together on lasting solutions. So that involves talking through the issues, but also the act of forgiveness, that when someone has asked to be forgiven, that you grant that forgiveness so that you can be restored in relationship.
All right, there is a heap there. Good thing we're running a course on this.
Absolutely.
But I like the sound of the go higher, but I'm immediately struck by the get real, get the log out of your own eye. It sounds like you're saying I just have to blame myself for everything that happens.
Is that what I said, Josh? That's not what I said.
Well,
that's your interpretation. I didn't say you have to blame yourself for everything, because that's actually, we would call that peace faking. That actually, to avoid dealing with conflict, you just say, okay, it's all me, it's always all me. Does that solve things? Not really. It actually just perpetuates an unhealthy relationship. What we are saying, though, is for whatever percentage you've contributed, even if it was just 2%, then be 100% responsible for that 2%. Take full ownership for your part in the conflict situation.
all right, so take 100% responsibility for my 2%. I like that.
Yeah, if it's just 2%, John.
That's a great sound. My 22098.
Yeah.
All right. Now the problem for me though is how am I going to get to the bottom of that 2%? Most of the time I don't even know why I'm fighting.
Yeah, well, the first Bible passage that we had read this morning from James gives some real insight as to where conflicts come from. It says, what causes fights and quarrels among you, uses very contemporary language, and it says, well, where a lot of them come from is the desires of our heart, the cravings that we have to get things that we want. And while some things can be perfectly good desires, good things, good to have some desires, peace in your home is not a bad thing in itself, but when it becomes so important that it changes from being a desire to a demand, something you have to have, and then when you don't get it, you judge the people who are stopping you getting it, and then you punish them for them not giving it to you, then that's a very unhealthy cycle where the desire becomes something that actually feeds the conflict because of what comes after it. Okay,
so back to the kitchen. You're saying there's kind of a sequence there that perhaps I have some good desires. I desire to have a full stomach, have some peace and quiet. Maybe if I dug deeper, I have a desire to have my family acknowledge the hard day I've spent at work. But what I do is I then turn that into a demand that I come in, I must have dinner on the table. Or I've turned this into this is what it must be to satisfy what I want. And if I don't get it, well, I can imagine with my kids, if I don't get that peace and quiet, I start judging them. You rude children. Why can't you just sit quietly at dinner and start jumping on them and say, why can't you just be quiet, always off the table and start?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what you're doing, that's the sequence.
Yeah, that's the progression.
Okay. How do we deal with that? Some of us will say, nod, yes, that's what happens to me, that's the sequence. How do we deal with our cravings? How do we address this?
Yeah, and so the second passage that we read this morning gives us some help for that as well. Because that cycle is very normal and natural for us to fall into. So we need something of a circuit breaker. And in the passage, it talks about how in our relationships we should seek to look not only to our own interests, but also to the interests of others. And you think, well, okay, that sounds good. And then the passage goes on to say, so in your relationship, don't be like your normal human self, which is all about getting what you want. Be like Jesus. Because Jesus, if anyone had the entitlement to having his desires and demands met, it was him. He was God. But instead of grasping on to things like that, he took on the nature of a servant and left heaven and actually gave his life in service for us. So that's the sort of model of like, okay, I'm going to try and be other person focused, and I'm going to consider not just my desires, but what other people need and want as well, and be servant oriented in the way that I live. So the great thing about that is not only is he sort of an example of how to break the circuit for conflict situations, but he's also the motivation and way of doing it as well, that we can put our trust in him and actually get help from him in conquering that sort of a pattern in our lives.
Okay, so this is now what you're referring to, I guess, in the go higher. I'm not just thinking horizontally now in my conflict. I'm thinking, how can I draw on a relationship with God to then play out in my relationships with others?
That's right.
Okay, fantastic. Now, imagine that I've addressed this in a way, starting to try and think vertically and horizontally. Let's imagine I now realise where my innocent dinner question came from. It really came from my own cravings. And I want to apologise. So perhaps the kids have gone to bed, it's after dinner. Let me try and flesh out an apology to my wife, who's sitting here as well. As I keep rushing, so this is a hypothetical example.
What are we doing that, John?
But I'd love you to critique my apology, because I think that'll help some of us when we're trying to think about how apology works. So let's say I say to Julie, look Julie, I'm really sorry that we had that fight about dinner. It's just that I'm tired after work, coming on a bit of peace and quiet, and you didn't even say hello, but that's not it. I just want to say I'm sorry. Will you forgive me? How's that? How to do?
What are people giving him? Big thumbs up? No, it's a stinker, isn't it? It's a stinker. There are at least 3 things wrong with that apology. Okay, let's start with the good. That at least there was a heart to say sorry. He realised he'd done it wrong, but he totally stuffed it. So first of all, sorry. First of all, excuse 1. Did you hear that there were 3 things that were wrong with it? Excuse 1, I'm just really tired. So there's justification for my bad behaviour. Excuse 2, or problem 2, you didn't even talk to me. It's your fault. You triggered me. And thirdly, but, there was a but in there. What was the but?
There were a few.
A few buts. Anytime you put a but into an apology, you just killed it stone dead. Because what you're actually doing is saying, I'm sorry, but there were good reasons for my bad behaviour. Therefore, I'm not really that sorry. And what the person hears when they hear but is they're not sorry at all. They're just justifying their bad behaviour.
Yeah.
So, if we're thinking about this little card that you've got with you, on the back there's 7 A's of confession. That is a really simple idiot's guide to giving a good apology. And if you follow that, you'll be amazed how much better your apologies will be. Don't forget the last part of a good apology is something that we in Australia don't do much, is actually ask to be forgiven. We might say sorry, and in a bloke's context, sorry mate, oh yeah, no worries, and that's it. But we don't actually ask, will you forgive me? Which is a critical part to a good apology.
Okay, so obviously my apology needs some work. Let's imagine I do that. My problem often in conflicts, when I think about my conflicts I've had in the workplace especially, is it's not getting only to my 2%, it's really hard. People don't take responsibility for their 98%. And how do I help them or their 50%?
Yeah.
How do I help them?
This is a good question, and it's a serious question because it is hard to talk to someone else about their contribution to a conflict situation. We typically, this is where we run a mile, we avoid it because we're scared of their reaction and we don't know how to do it. In the course that you're going to run here, there is a whole night dedicated to this. And some quick things. First of all, prepare your heart. If your heart is well prepared, people will read your heart and see that you're not out to get them. You're actually wanting to have a conversation that is healthy and constructive. Secondly, say how much you value the relationship before you get into pointing out what's wrong with what they've done. Because relationships, when you hear that, you think, oh, they're actually wanting to do something healthy here. Thirdly, prepare a little bit about what you're going to say. Listen well, and choose your words wisely, and choose a good time to have that conversation, not when they're really busy and about to go out. A good time for them. There's a whole lot of other things that you can do, but especially the heart preparation and saying how much you value the relationship will be a good start.
Yeah, and you've got a tool on the card there for that, so that's the pause principle.
Yeah, the pause principle is like a 5-point plan for actually when you're trying to talk about how to work through a material issue that you need to work through. There's guidance there on how to do that.
Right, that does sound like a whole other set of skills I need to work on as well. I suspect for many of us here, the real problem though isn't always just helping the other person. It's when we start getting to this topic of forgiveness, when the other person apologises to us, even if they do, it's very, very hard to... So what are we talking about when we talk about forgiveness? What is this thing called forgiveness? Is it just, like they say, forgive and forget?
Yeah. So forgive and forget is the most commonly used expression in relation to forgiveness, and it is conventional wisdom of zero value.
Right.
Honestly, forgive and forget is misconceived because it sort of presents the idea that you just sort of, okay, that's fine, let's just forget about it. As if you could. Most serious things that need forgiveness can't ever be forgotten as such. The whole blessing of forgiveness is that even while remembering the thing that was done wrong to you, you forgive. So forgiveness is the extension of grace and mercy despite the wrong that's happened. Not trying to pretend it didn't happen or forget about it, but actually by extending forgiveness, you remove the barrier between you and the person, and you take away, if you like, the rightful penalty that wrongful act has caused between you and them, and you say, I take that away. And you might even be able to make some of the promises that we have on this card. I'm not going to dwell on this incident anymore. I'm not going to bring it up and use it against you. I'm not going to talk to others about it. And I'm not going to allow this incident to stand between us and hinder our personal relationship. So that might sound like, a whole lot of things on a card, but actually, ultimately, we need God's help. We really need God's help. If it's something significant, we need to get God's help to be able to find that place in our heart to forgive. And looking to what God has done for us and forgiving us through Jesus is the best help we can find.
So we're going to go by forgiveness from above.
Yeah.
It's our horizontal.
Yeah.
Yes, and it sounds like, I suspect for many of us, forgiveness is a long process. It's not just a bullet point process. Look, I think the best way for us to really get a picture of this is to ask, in your experience, do you have a story of hope? Some of us don't need a process or a tool so much as we just need some hope that forgiveness could happen, a relationship could be restored. So can you give us a story of where forgiveness has been granted?
Yeah, so this is a story from my own life, and rather than picking like a big dramatic story, seeing as we're talking about everyday conflict and we're trying to keep this real, I'll just share a story from my family life with Helen. And so this was when Lachlan was still a baby, and Helen had arranged a special lunch with some girlfriends to show him off. One of those lunches where you take the baby and everyone goes Yeah. So, yeah. We understand that as men. So, I was at college and I got one of those disturbing phone calls. You know, guys, when you get the phone call from your wife and you think, oh, I wonder what this is about, and then you wish. So, Helen says, Hun, you don't happen to have both sets of car keys with you, do you? Sinking feeling, look in the bag. Oh no. So, yes, actually I do. So that began a really unfortunate series of events, because what happened then was Helen obviously couldn't use the car to drive to the lunch that she'd organised. So she had to ring a cab, which meant she was going to be late. It was hot. When the cab arrived, the cab didn't have the baby capsule it was supposed to happen. So then she had to call another cab, which was late. She ended up being nearly an hour late for that special lunch. She arrived hot, flustered. There was less time to show him off. The whole thing got ruined, and it was all my fault. It really was my fault. So,
But it was an accident.
It wasn't intentional. I certainly didn't mean to cause her the pain and suffering that I did, but it was my thoughtlessness.
Okay.
So I didn't intend to hurt her, but by being thoughtless and taking both sets of keys, I did. And that's often what happens in conflict. We don't mean to hurt someone, but we still do. And even though we didn't mean it, it still hurts and we still need to own it. So thankfully I had learnt these principles at that time. And when I came home, I genuinely apologised and took ownership for what I'd done and asked her for forgiveness with sort of heart in mouth, because I really knew I'd ruined her day and I felt terrible about it. And Helen, my beautiful wife, kindly and graciously forgave me and genuinely forgave me and has never brought it up and made me suffer about it since.
So she doesn't pull it out and say, remember that time?
No, she's not like
Always.
No, it was a genuine forgiveness where that was just done, and it was one of those unfortunate, sad events. But these principles really worked to help us so that I could own my 100% in that situation and she could graciously forgive me. So I'm very thankful for having such a beautiful and loving and forgiving wife, and these principles work to help us.
All right, that's great to get a glimpse of hope. For many of us, we're not there yet. It's a light at the end of the tunnel at best. And I think it'd be wonderful if you could pray for us, because I think there's a whole bunch of conflicts represented here this morning at different stages. Perhaps we can finish by you just praying for us in all our conflicts, that we might find hope and restoration of relationship.
I would love to do that.
Let's do that.
Dear loving Heavenly Father, you are the God of hope. Every single one of us here in this room struggles from time to time with conflict. We have relationships that are precious to us, that are just, sometimes we feel like they're torture. Other times we just wish a person would change, or we wish we change, and we struggle to do that. So Lord, you are the God of hope, and you are the God of peace, and you've brought peace to us. Through your Son Jesus, you gave your only Son to die for us so that we could have peace with you, and that he could model just being other person focused so that we might take the opportunity to try and make peace with others. Lord, help us to learn from your Son, help us to learn from the principles in your word, and especially give us courage where we know we've done wrong, where we know we've hurt someone. Give us courage to put our pride aside, to be able to own what we've done, to repent before you and experience your forgiveness, knowing Jesus has forgiven us, and then to go to the other person and without qualifications and buts, ask them to forgive us for what we've done as well. Lord, I pray that even out of today, there might be some relationships that are restored, some reconciliation that takes place, and that we might come closer to you and to others through the things that you've shared with us and through the example of your Son Jesus. And we pray these things in his name.